At the company's holiday party, I saw the boss kissing my wife, so I went up to them, and with a tightness in my chest, I just said, "Make yourself at home, my role ends here." I left without waiting for a response, leaving behind more than just a marriage. I also left behind the illusion. Over time, she discovered that her boss only wanted moments, not a future, and she ended up alone, dealing with the emptiness of her own mistake. I moved on, rebuilding my life with someone who offers me loyalty, peaceful silence, and a genuine presence. Years later, when we saw each other, she asked for forgiveness with her eyes. I gave mine, completely, but made it clear, I forgave to move on in peace, not to start over what never returns. And that was when she understood her choice. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for that scene, for the image that still haunts me in sleepless nights, when silence weighs more heavily than memories. When I arrived at that party, it wasn't just any get-together. It was the end of a work cycle, and I had gone for her. I'm not the kind of man who enjoys corporate events, but I made a point of going to please. She was beautiful, in that way she knew she could undo me, tight black dress, loose hair, razor-sharp smile. But what I didn't know was that that smile, which for years I thought was mine, was now being loaned to someone else. There was no hesitation. The kiss was direct, shameless, almost as if I didn't exist. He held her waist with the familiarity of someone who'd been doing this for days, maybe weeks. And she responded with the intensity of someone who'd forgotten they had a home. I froze. Time stood still, but my blood ran hot. I took 2 steps. Maybe 3. And with a lump in my throat that threatened to swallow me whole, I said it. That phrase that, to this day, echoes deep in her soul, and mine, "Make yourself at home, my role ends here." He said it as if he were laying down his weapons. As if he were recognizing the lost war. There was no scandal. There were no punches. There were no tears there, not at that moment. Just a dull pain, tearing inside, with the dignity of someone who chose not to humiliate themselves. I didn't wait for her to say anything. Because the silence she gave me while she kissed someone else in front of everyone had been answer enough. I left empty-handed and my chest full of broken pieces. People don't notice when a man breaks inside. They think pain must come with screams, that anger must bleed visibly. But my pain was silent, dense, alive. Each step away from her was a shovelful of dirt thrown over the story I'd been building for years. And yet, I kept walking. Without looking back. Because if I had, I'd beg. And she didn't deserve my plea. Or my return. After that night, I didn't speak to her again. No calls. No messages. I disappeared from her life as if I'd never existed. I moved house, got a haircut, changed my route, my music, my perfume. I even changed my breakfast. Because everything about her was rooted in my habits. Everything needed to be removed from me, like ancient poison. And while I silently rebuilt my world, she discovered, too late, that what seemed like an adventure was just ego on the other side. That the man she chose over me didn't want a future. Didn't want promises. He just wanted to be desired. A game of vanity. She bet love on a roulette wheel of momentary desire. And she lost. As days turned into months, and months into years, I was somewhere else. With another woman. One who spoke little but looked deeply. Who held my hand as if she knew exactly what she had healed. And then came the reunion. It wasn't planned. Life, sometimes, has a sense of irony. We bumped into each other in some random place, with no spotlights, no background music. She looked at me as if pleading without words. And I, inside, felt that old wound throb. But it no longer hurt. Because I had chosen peace. And with that peace, I looked at her and said, with a clean soul, I forgave. She tried to smile, but her eyes, her eyes were filled with regret. The kind of regret that doesn't apologize, because it knows there's nothing left to save. The choice had already been made. Time doesn't come back. And the love I once gave had already moved on. She felt, in that moment, what I felt at that party, the exact moment when something inside you dies and there's no going back. But what she didn't yet know, what no one knew, was that the real punishment wasn't my absence. Nor the silence. Nor the end of the marriage. The real punishment came years later, when she wanted to feel for the last time what it was like to be truly loved. When, unable to forget, she decided to return to the place where it all began. Our old apartment. It was for sale. I had moved out shortly after the divorce, but for some reason, she thought revisiting the past might bring some relief. She got the key from an inattentive real estate agent. She let herself in. And inside, the air felt different. There was no furniture. There was no sound. Just the bare walls and a few paintings leaning on the floor, left behind by the last tenant. Among them, a frame had fallen, on its back. As she turned it over, she froze. It was a photo of us, taken on some random anniversary, smiling like someone who believed in forever. She walked to the wall where this and other photos used to hang. There were marks, rusty nails, blank spaces. She placed her hand there, as if to touch time. She cried. She cried in a way she never cried when she lost me. Because there, alone, surrounded by echoes of a love she destroyed with her own hands, she finally understood. It wasn't just about losing me. It was about never finding that look again. That kind of love. That kind of peace. And the cruelest part, she knew that all of that could still be hers, if she had chosen differently. But the story doesn't end there. Because that very night, as she left the apartment, something happened. A gesture. A detail. Something that changed everything. And it was there, in that specific moment, that she truly understood what it means to lose someone who truly loved you. But that's another part of the story. And it starts right after. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not romanticize or justify cheating, we expose it. All the stories are fictional, but the feelings are real. The goal is clear, to show how infidelity destroys lives, trust and loves that could last forever. Get ready. What you're about to hear is more than just a story. It's a reality check. Good story. They met on an autumn afternoon, the kind that carries a certain beautiful silence, as if the whole world paused for a second to observe the meeting of two destinies. Ethan wasn't the kind of man who immediately drew attention, wasn't loud, nor was he one to impose himself through his presence. He possessed a calm that was impressive. He spoke little, but always firmly, and listened with a rare attention, as if absorbing every word with respect. He worked in administration at a mid-sized company and lived a simple life, without grand ambitions, but with an ethic he held dear, the kind you learn not from books, but from pain and truth. Olivia, on the other hand, had always been a hurricane in the shape of a woman. Intelligent, quick with words, determined, and with a restlessness that vibrated in every gesture. With a degree in marketing, she was always seeking something more emotion, more challenges, more intensity. She had that look in her eyes that seemed to be searching for something, even when it was already complete. Their first encounter was during a company training course. A glance lasted only seconds, but planted a seed that would blossom unexpectedly. Their rapprochement was gradual. Short conversations during breaks, exchanges of laughter over trivial matters, shy messages that turned into hours of conversation after work. Ethan, with his calm, offered her something she didn't know she needed, stability. And Olivia, with her intensity, offered him everything he'd never dared to desire, movement, passion, high-frequency living. They were opposites in form, but they fit together in essence. They began dating without much ceremony and soon became known among their friends for the rare balance they forged. They cared for each other with a naturalness that was moving. Birthdays were simple, but filled with presence. There was no ostentation, only care. Ethan made breakfast on weekends, Olivia left notes around the house with sweet words on random days. It was as if every gesture, no matter how small, said, "I see you." When they decided to live together, it wasn't out of pressure or necessity. It was out of true love. Their shared routine only strengthened their bond. Ethan was methodical with his tasks, but he learned to deal with Olivia's creative chaos. She, in turn, found a kind of safe haven in his quirks. They divided their days between work, TV shows, simple dinners, and short trips to quiet places. They had a favorite spot on the balcony, where they would talk for hours about everything and nothing. Life continued with its ups and downs, like any real relationship, but without major ruptures. There was respect. There was dialogue. And above all, there was a deep friendship, the kind that weathers any storm. Close friends always commented on how they complemented each other. "You're good together," they'd often say. And they truly were. There were days when Olivia, tired from the intense pace of work, would lie on his lap and simply stay there, silent, while he stroked her hair and shut the world out. There were afternoons when Ethan, immersed in his insecurities, found in her an inexplicable strength. She'd look at him and say, "It'll work out," and he'd believe her, even without knowing why. Their relationship was built on layers: trust, commitment, companionship. And even when there were disagreements, everything was resolved through conversation and, sometimes, that hug that dismantles any defenses. Over time, Ethan rose through the ranks within the company, gaining recognition for his consistent results and the way he worked with people. He wasn't a traditional leader, but he inspired by example. Olivia, with her innate talent for communication and strategy, began leading larger projects, gaining prominence and visibility. She loved challenges, loved feeling in control, but at the same time, she always returned home with a smile, sharing her victories with him. Ethan was always her first listener, her biggest cheerleader. And she was, for him, the spark that made his days more vibrant. They built a life together without rushing. Nothing was immediate, everything was chosen intentionally. The house was assembled gradually, with every detail telling a story. The living room bookshelf was made by a carpenter friend, the sofa was chosen after 3 afternoons of shopping, and every item hanging on the wall had a shared meaning. When they spoke of the future, they spoke calmly. There was no urgency, just plans. Maybe children someday. Maybe a bigger house, a dog. But now was good. Now was full. At family gatherings, they were seen as exemplary couples. Ethan, always polite, made a point of chatting with everyone, even if he sometimes felt out of place. Olivia was more spontaneous, laughing loudly, dominating the room, but always returning to him, tugging at his hand, caressing his arm, as if to reaffirm, "You belong here." And he returned it with that serene look, the kind only true love can hold. Despite this, there were nuances. Small distances that emerge and, if left unchecked, grow. Olivia began going out more often with work colleagues for events, trips, and meetings out of town. Ethan understood, he'd always trusted her, but inside, sometimes, he felt a discomfort hard to name. It wasn't jealousy, it was absence. Her presence began to become more rarefied in the details. Breakfasts became rushed, notes disappeared. And he, perhaps afraid of appearing insecure, never asked. He continued to support, continued to smile, continued to remain silent. Because love, for him, has always been synonymous with respecting the other person's space, even when that space hurt. Olivia, for her part, began to feel a restlessness she couldn't explain. Everything about Ethan was right. He was kind, caring, a partner, but somewhere inside her, a longing grew for something she couldn't quite name. It was a dissatisfaction that stemmed not from him, but from life itself. Maybe it was the constant pressure to prove herself at work, maybe it was the fear of stagnation, maybe it was just the inner chaos some people carry around, which, from time to time, explodes for no reason. The love between them still existed, but it began to be tested by the gaps in daily life. She came home later, he went to bed earlier. Their once-long conversations became occasional exchanges. And yet, there was still respect. He still cooked dinner when she said she'd be tired when she arrived. She still bought his favorite chocolates when she stopped by the grocery store. But the sparkle in their gestures was gone. It was as if they were both trying to keep something alive that time was subtly trying to extinguish. One random weekend, they decided to take a few days off for a short trip. Just the two of them. Away from everything. They wanted to reconnect, to reconnect. The trip was good. They walked, laughed, and had deeper conversations. They talked about the future, fears, and old dreams. They made love with the gentleness of those who still love each other, but with the urgency of those who feel it might not last. When they returned, there was a bittersweet feeling in the air. As if they had taken one last breath before something changed. Ethan, despite his silent doubts, suspected nothing. He continued to believe that, even with the distance, they were just going through a phase. Like so many others they've overcome. Olivia, inside, was in turmoil. Choices were being made in silence. Desires were being nurtured in the shadows. But what Ethan valued most was trust. And she, for now, hadn't broken it. Not directly. At the company, the work environment was becoming more competitive. New leadership emerged, and with them, new dynamics. Olivia began working with a new direct manager. An older, charming, and eloquent man. Someone who knew how to play with words and recognized her talent immediately. Ethan heard a few stories about him, which Olivia mentioned casually, always in a professional context. And he, as always, believed her. But meanwhile, the silences at home grew longer. Eyes parted more frequently. Dinner was now cooked by him alone, often waiting for a response that came too late. "I'm staying late today, we have an important delivery." And he'd reply, "Okay, love. Take care." Even when he meant to say, "Come back to me." On the surface, everything seemed stable. They were still seen as a close couple. There were still recent photos on social media. There were still kisses at the door before work. But the essence was beginning to bite. And what Ethan didn't yet know was that, beneath that calm surface, a storm was already brewing. That soon, everything that seemed secure, everything he'd built with dedication and truth, would be put to the test in ways he never imagined. When Olivia was promoted to lead a new branding project, something in her seemed to ignite. It wasn't just the euphoria of a new responsibility, but the way she spoke of the team, the new dynamics, the trust they were placing in her. Ethan saw her eyes shine with an intensity he hadn't seen in a long time, but that glow no longer seemed directed at him. It was as if she'd found a new point of gravity, something that pulled her attention and presence away from home. Still, he tried not to overthink, reminded himself of who she was, how passionate she'd always been about what she did, and tried to find solace in the idea that this was just another phase. But deep down, a new uneasiness began to grow, silent, uncomfortable. The emotional distance took on new dimensions as Olivia's schedule became increasingly unpredictable. Meetings stretched into the night, last-minute trips, messages answered late and sometimes curtly. Ethan remained understanding. He cooked dinner even without knowing if she would come. He kept the house tidy, took care of the daily details, but her absence began to weigh heavily, creating a void between them that no amount of affection could fill. Weekends that had once been sacred became occupied by strategic events, and even when they were together, she was always checking her phone, as if something more important could happen at any moment. One of those nights when she arrived late, unannounced, he was waiting for her with an open bottle of wine and 2 glasses already poured. It was an attempt to reconnect, to draw her back into the space they both called home. When she entered, tired, he smiled with the lightness of someone who still believed love was enough, but she simply dropped her bag, kissed him on the forehead, and went straight to the shower. He stood there, staring at the 2 untouched glasses. The silence in the room seemed to scream, and that night he couldn't sleep well. Something inside him whispered that something was out of place, something that could no longer be ignored. As the weeks passed, small signs began to accumulate. A subtle change in her perfume, new clothes he'd never seen before, a different laugh on calls she'd claimed were professional. Ethan tried to rationalize. He thought maybe it was just wear and tear, maybe the routine. He remembered all the advice he'd heard about not being paranoid, about giving her space. But there was a strange chill on the back of his neck, a painful intuition that kept him from relaxing. One night, while she slept soundly, he stared at the ceiling, feeling the weight of doubt turning into fear. For the first time, he considered asking her directly, but decided against it. Because there was a part of him that still preferred doubt to certainty. Olivia, for her part, struggled internally with the guilt that was slowly creeping in. She knew she was crossing a line, even without putting it into words. Her involvement with Thomas, her manager, began subtly, almost imperceptibly. He admired her, complimented her with a frequency Ethan no longer had. She spoke with that confident tone that made her feel alive, desired, needed. At first, it was just vanity. A harmless flirtation, a passing glance during meetings, a tension in the air they both pretended not to notice. But all it took was one night, a business trip, an extra glass of wine, and an empty hotel corridor for the line to be crossed. And after that, everything changed. She tried to act as if nothing had happened, but her body gave it away. The way she dressed, her attention to detail, her impatience with the silences at home. There was a new world in her head, and in that world, Ethan no longer fit. And yet, he remained there, offering love and patience with a purity that shamed her. She began to avoid him, not looking directly into his eyes, making excuses not to touch him at night. When he approached, she recoiled. And when he retreated, she felt relief and guilt in equal measure. It was like being caught between two lives, one she had built on truth, and another that emerged from desire and illusion. During the company's social gathering week, Ethan decided he would go. He wanted to escape his routine, to see up close the world she was so deeply immersed in. Olivia hesitated, trying to convince him not to go, saying it would be boring, that he didn't know anyone. But he insisted. He needed to see, needed to be close, needed to remember who she was outside of home. She relented, but with obvious discomfort, as if fearing something he wasn't yet ready to confront. On the night of the party, she seemed nervous. She was beautiful, as always, but restless. They arrived together, but she soon walked away, saying she needed to greet colleagues. Ethan stood near the bar, watching. He tried to chat with some employees, smiled politely, but couldn't concentrate. His eyes searched for her constantly. He saw her from afar, laughing, gesturing intensely. Around her, a lively group, among them Thomas. The man he only knew by name, but who was now more than a face, a presence. Time passed slowly. Olivia seemed increasingly engaged in the conversation, the surroundings, the attention she was receiving. At one point, she walked away with Thomas to a more private area. Ethan instinctively followed her gaze. And when he realized they were alone, something pulled him. He crossed the room, past the guests, his heart heavy. When he turned the corner and saw the two of them, the touch on the waist, the faces too close, the quick but evident kiss, he didn't feel anger, he didn't explode. He felt a silence inside him he'd never experienced before. It was like watching the end of a movie you loved but couldn't continue. He walked toward them, and when they both realized his presence, their gazes froze. Olivia, pale. Thomas, disconcerted. But Ethan held his ground. He took a deep breath, his heart pounding like a muffled drum. And then he said, with a calmness that hurt more than any shout, "Make yourself at home, my role ends here." He didn't wait for answers. He didn't ask for an explanation. He turned and walked away, leaving behind not just a marriage, but a piece of the life he believed to be real. That night, the house was completely silent. He arrived, took off his shoes, sat on the sofa, and stayed there for hours, staring into the void. Everything he'd built, everything he believed in, crumbled in seconds. But what he didn't yet know, was that the betrayal was just the surface. A mere detail compared to the secret that would come to light. A secret that would forever change the way he saw everything. And everyone. Ethan spent the next few days as if walking in a dream where everything lost its meaning. There was no exploding anger, nor melodramatic sadness. It was something else, something deeper, the realization that he had loved alone in the end, and that all the small gestures he thought were truly reciprocated might never have been about true love, but rather habit, comfort, or convenience. Olivia didn't come home that night, nor the next day. She left a single, short note, saying she would respect his space. He didn't respond. He didn't want to know where she was. He didn't want to know with whom. For the first time in years, he felt no need for explanations. You just needed to be silent. The house, once full of meaning, now felt like a hollow box, where every corner carried the echo of a name that no longer made sense. The place where they had laughed, shared wine, shared plans, where they had made love so many times with delicacy, now felt like a museum piece, frozen in time, full of dead memories. The betrayal was a fact. And yet, he couldn't bring himself to hate her. Not in the way one might expect. There was hurt, of course. There was disappointment. But there was also a strange compassion. Maybe because he knew she was lost. Maybe because he had the impression she herself still didn't understand everything she'd done. But what Ethan didn't know was that there was something beyond, something still shrouded in silence, something that would explain so much, and, at the same time, destroy even more. The secret. It was weeks later, on a cloudy late afternoon, that Olivia appeared at the apartment door. Her face haggard, her eyes bearing the weight of what could no longer be undone. She entered without saying a word, and he, for some reason he didn't even understand, allowed her. They sat across from each other on the same sofa where they had so often gazed lovingly at each other. Now there was a distance between them that seemed insurmountable. She tried to speak, but her voice faltered. He simply stared at her, waiting. Not in a rush, but with the calm of someone who no longer expects to be surprised. And that was when she took a deep breath, closed her eyes for a second, and told him there was something he needed to know. Something that wasn't about Thomas, nor the betrayal, nor the impulsive choice she had made. But rather about the past she had hidden from him. A past that lived in the wall of an empty apartment and that, sooner or later, would come to light. Olivia recounted a visit to their old home weeks earlier. She was alone, on her way to a meeting in the area, and, driven by an almost unhealthy nostalgia, she decided to ask the real estate agent to let her in. She wanted to revisit the space where they had been happy, or perhaps just prove to herself that she still cared. The apartment was empty, with a few boxes left unoccupied, forgotten by previous tenants. And it was in one of these boxes that she found the fallen frame. A photo of them. They were smiling, embracing, on some random anniversary. It was an image she vaguely remembered but hadn't realized had been printed. Turning the frame over, she found behind it several folded letters, carefully secured with a rubber band. They were letters written by Ethan during the years of their relationship. Letters he never delivered. Letters of love, of frustration, of doubts, of gratitude. He had written about nights he felt invisible, about fears of losing her, about admiration, about exhaustion, about wanting to be better for her, even when she pushed him away. They were records of a man who loved in silence, even on the days when it hurt. And she never knew. Olivia told all of this with a shaky voice, barely able to breathe between words. She said she read every letter and cried with each one. She said she felt ashamed. She never imagined how much he fought for them, while she looked outside, searching for something she already had at home. She said that, in that moment, she understood he wasn't the problem. That he never was. She said that for the first time, she saw how stupid it was to destroy that love for a fleeting desire. But that wasn't all. There was more. And Ethan, silent, continued to listen. The secret she held most painfully wasn't about kissing another man, nor about getting involved with someone at work. It was about doing something before all this. Something she never told anyone because she thought it wouldn't make a difference. But it did. A lot. During a period when their relationship was strained, about a year before the betrayal took place, Olivia had suffered an emotional relapse with someone from the past. An ex-boyfriend, with whom she'd been exchanging messages for weeks and met twice. She swore it was nothing more than that there had been no touching, no kissing, that it was just an emotional reunion that confused her. But what destroyed her was the realization that, at that time, she had already left Ethan alone. Not physically, but spiritually. Because even if she hadn't cheated physically, she had already stopped choosing him long before the betrayal with Thomas happened. She was no longer whole. And the secret was this: the real betrayal wasn't the kiss at the party, it was the silent, cowardly, gradual giving up, while he continued fighting for a love she no longer held. Ethan closed his eyes when he heard it. His body felt heavy. Not from the revelation itself, but from the confirmation of an old intuition he'd always had and kept quiet about. He simply said he wasn't surprised. That he'd already felt it. That he simply didn't want to see it because, when you truly love, you'd rather deceive yourself than believe you're losing. Olivia, her eyes brimming with tears, begged him to understand. She said she regretted it. That if she could go back, she would have done everything differently. That now she saw what she'd lost. But he didn't respond right away. He stood up, walked to the bookshelf where he kept some mementos, pulled out a small box, and placed it on the table. He opened it. There were her notes, carefully guarded. The letters she'd left him in their early years. Photos of the two of them on trips. And, at the bottom of the box, a ring. The ring he'd taken off on the day of the party. He picked it up, looked at it for a moment, and then said that the love he felt for her was the truest he could have given. He said that, for that very reason, he could never accept half-heartedness. That he didn't want to be a second option, nor a return for a mistake. That he forgave her, yes. Because she deserved peace. But he didn't want to go back. She cried. Not out of anger. Not out of wounded pride. She cried because, in that moment, she realized she had lost something that would never return. Not out of revenge. Not out of coldness. But because the love she had destroyed, once dead, would never be reborn. Ethan was no longer the same. And what had been between them, now, was only a memory. She tried to reach out, to touch his hand, but he respectfully pulled away. He said he hoped she would be happy. That she would find what she was looking for. But not with him. And with that, he got up, left the apartment, and left behind not only a regretful woman, but his entire past. The world moved on. But something inside her was never the same. Because what she saw in his eyes that day wasn't contempt. It was forgiveness. And that forgiveness, given with such serenity, was the hardest blow. Because it sealed the end. An end she had caused. And which now, finally, she fully understood. Olivia remained in the apartment for long minutes after Ethan left, standing in the center of the living room as if expelled from her own body. The place felt smaller, suffocating, as if his absence had sucked all the air from the room. The sound of silence was deafening. She walked slowly through the rooms, like someone walking through the rubble of a bombed-out city, touching her fingers to the walls, remembering the days when those walls had witnessed laughter, plans whispered in the wee hours, and a kind of love that now existed only in ruins. She sat on the floor in front of the box where he had stored everything, his old notes, travel photos, small objects that had once been tokens of affection. She tried to touch the memories as if she could somehow stitch together time, but everything slipped through her fingers like dry sand. She wept, not as if begging for redemption, but as if finally accepting her sentence. There was no going back. There was no excuse. The end was irrevocable, and she was the only one to blame. In the days that followed, she tried to carry on. Returning to work was like walking with broken bones, disguising the pain with automatic smiles and professional words. Thomas, noticing her withdrawal, tried to reach out, but she cut him off coldly. She said it no longer made sense, that he wasn't what she wanted, nor had he ever been. And he, with that inflated ego he always disguised as charm, responded with indifference, as if he'd already expected it. Within a few weeks, she found herself alone. Her fleeting romance with Thomas didn't withstand the first brush of reality. Her colleagues, hearing of the rumors, began to treat her with a certain distance, not out of moral judgment, but out of discomfort. And the days, once full of commitments and adrenaline, became too long. At home, loneliness manifested itself in the details: a toothbrush alone in the cup, 2 glasses that were never used together, the bed made on only one side. Ethan, on the other hand, immersed himself in a process of silent reconstruction. He didn't seek superficial distractions, didn't throw himself into parties or new adventures. He began investing time in himself, resuming old hobbies, reconnecting with old friends, and, above all, rebuilding his relationship with himself. He left the apartment and moved into a new space, smaller, more airy, with less history, but with more possibilities. Each object there was chosen calmly, carefully, as if each corner of the house now needed to contain only that which brought peace. He knew the scars wouldn't disappear, but he learned to live with them. He learned, above all, that sometimes you have to lose to understand what you should never have accepted. It was in a small neighborhood bookstore that he met Clara. She didn't appear as a whiff of passion, but as a gentle encounter. A conversation about forgotten authors that turned into coffee, then a walk under the gray sky, then an exchange of confidences. Clara was different from Olivia in every way. She had a quiet sweetness, a lightness in her gaze that didn't seek approval. She didn't want dazzlement, she didn't want promises. She wanted presence. And with her, Ethan learned something he had never experienced before: the peace that exists when love doesn't demand, doesn't hurt, doesn't weigh down. Months passed, and the news that Ethan was in a new relationship reached Olivia by chance. A mutual friend mentioned it casually, unaware of the impact those words would have. Olivia said nothing. He just smiled at the corner of his mouth, but inside, something sank. It wasn't jealousy. It was a mirror of what could have been. A cruel reminder that he had moved on, and she, still stuck in the past, was collecting regrets. That night, she scrolled through his social media. The few photos revealed a serene man, holding hands with Clara at a street fair, laughing next to a dog, sitting in a coffee shop with a book on his lap. There was a light there she no longer recognized. A light that had once belonged to his gaze on her. But it was no longer there. One afternoon, as she was leaving work, Olivia ran into Ethan by chance. It was brief. He was walking from the other side of the street, hand in hand with Clara, and only saw her when he was already too close. Their eyes met for a few seconds. He stopped politely, discreetly released Clara's hand, and simply said, "Hi." Olivia responded with a wave. Clara smiled elegantly. There was a brief silence. Ethan then asked how she was, with genuine kindness, without hurt, without sarcasm. And it hurt. She replied that she was fine, that things were progressing. He nodded, as if he understood more than he was saying. There was no invitation to talk. There was no question about the past. Just a light, polite goodbye, and they walked in opposite directions. But Olivia stood still for a few moments, watching his retreating back, feeling the weight of everything that was no longer hers. That night, she wrote a letter. Not to send, but to ease the pain. She wrote about everything: her mistakes, her choices, what she felt, what she lost. She wrote that she loved him, but took too long to realize it. That her love, when it arrived, found only the rubble of a man who was no longer there. That she now understood it wasn't about forgiveness or return. It was about learning from the pain. She said, through tears, that what hurt most wasn't that he had moved on, but that she hadn't taken advantage of it when she had it. It was that he had been everything she had asked for her entire life, and that she, out of fear, had turned her back. Time passed with brutal indifference. Olivia began to live a more reserved life. You stopped seeking the validation you lacked in your work. He began therapy, confronting the parts of her he'd ignored for years. He began to look at himself more honestly. He was no longer trying to find a new Ethan. He understood that this was unique, that some people only pass through once. And, in a way, he learned to respect absence as one would respect a lesson. Ethan and Clara, for their part, continued their lives with a steady, calm step. There was no rush, no ghosts haunting them. He told her about Olivia honestly. He didn't hide the past, but he didn't carry it with him either. He was a new, whole man, and Clara loved him for it. One night, sitting on the couch, she asked if he still thought about everything he'd been through. He replied that sometimes he did, but not with pain. With learning. He said the betrayal hadn't broken him. What saved him was the self-love that grew from rock bottom. And for that, he was grateful. Clara hugged him tightly, as if understanding every word spoken in the silence. Years later, Olivia ran into an old acquaintance who had also worked with Ethan. They chatted briefly, and at the end, he said, "You know, I really admire Ethan. He's a rare man. Loyal to the end. And you know what? He never said a bad word about you." She smiled, her eyes brimming with tears, and simply replied, "He was too good for me. And I only realized it too late." She kept walking, lighter now, but with that scar that never fades. Because some losses aren't punishment, they're consequences. And she knew deeply, that the biggest mistake of her life wasn't the betrayal itself, but betraying a love that was true. And the most painful thing of all was knowing that this kind of love doesn't come back. It never comes back. Life didn't stop after that definitive conversation, but continued in a different way, as if it had shifted gears without anyone noticing. Ethan, when he left the apartment that day, didn't carry hatred in his chest, nor that kind of loud pain that consumes the senses. What he carried was something else, denser, deeper, somewhere between relief and mourning. It was like burying something he loved deeply, but which had been dead for a long time, only he didn't want to admit it. In that moment, there was no doubt that his decision had been made. It wasn't just about forgiving, or moving on, it was about closing a story that, however beautiful, no longer belonged to him. There was no room for the old love in a heart that had learned to breathe on its own. And that, though hard, was liberating. The days passed with a new rhythm. Clara followed him, unhurriedly, unpressured. She understood the depth of what had happened in his life and never tried to compete with ghosts. She was sensitive enough to recognize when silence was necessary, and firm enough not to allow him to get lost in the past. Together, they began to build small routines, walking in the park on Sundays, preparing dinner for two on Wednesdays, visiting antique fairs on Saturdays. Everything simple, yet charged with meaning. The house that had once been a solitary refuge now gained color, lightness, the aroma of fresh coffee on sunny mornings and shared laughter in the late nights. Ethan, little by little, rediscovered himself in Clara's light affection, in the comfortable silences, and in the absence of pressure. It was a new, different, more mature love. A love born of ruin but built with firm roots. On the other side, Olivia faced the real weight of her choices. Not just in the judgment of others, but in the inner judgment that is impossible to silence. She no longer lived with excuses, no longer sought justifications. She had accepted her own responsibility, and so guilt had a different taste, more bitter, more honest. She no longer defended herself against her own conscience. When she woke up and there were no more good morning messages, no more coffee prepared, no more that peaceful gaze waiting for her in the living room, she realized, brutally, what she had let slip through her fingers. Olivia began to walk alone, truly. Not just physically, but emotionally. What at first was a silence filled with regret gradually transformed into introspection. Therapy helped her organize her thoughts, to face versions of herself she had ignored for years. She looked in the mirror and saw a woman who had long chased external recognition, ignoring what was essential, her inner truth. It was on one of those days of inner silence that she found the box with the letters again. Not by chance, but like someone who needs to face something one last time. She read it all over again, letter by letter, and in that rereading, she noticed details that had previously gone unnoticed. Words he wrote between the lines, phrases that screamed love even as they spoke of pain. He felt the impact of each line with more maturity. It wasn't just longing. It was awareness. He understood that what destroyed her most wasn't the fact that she'd been abandoned, but the fact that he'd chosen to leave only after fighting to the limit. Ethan didn't give up early, didn't run away from the first setback. He stayed. He tried. And she left inside long before she left outside. And now, even if I wanted to come back, there was no one there waiting. And it was during this process of rebuilding that Olivia began to grapple with a dilemma that wouldn't leave her alone. Time had passed, yes, but something still haunted her, the doubt that she would ever deserve love again. Not idealized love, not comfort disguised as a relationship, but the kind of love that demands honest surrender. Because, after losing a man who gave her everything without reservation, she questioned whether, at some point in her life, she would be able to love with the same dignity with which she was loved. It wasn't about winning Ethan back anymore. She knew he had ended that cycle with the wisdom of someone who understands the value of his own peace. It was about forgiving herself enough to allow something new to be born without the shadow of what she destroyed. It was about becoming a better person, not for the other person, but for herself. Meanwhile, Ethan was also facing his own dilemmas. Even though Clara was a calm and genuine new chapter, there were nights when, involuntarily, he found himself remembering who he was by Olivia's side. Not out of longing, but out of identification. He knew that part of who he was today was shaped by the scars of that relationship. He was sometimes afraid of becoming too cold, too rational, of losing the vulnerability that true love demands. And it was Clara who, in an unexpected moment, gave him the answer he needed. They were sitting at the table on an ordinary evening when she said, "You don't need to be afraid to feel. What you've been through hasn't hardened you, it's just taught you to choose better. You still have a heart. I see it here, every day, in the details." These words, spoken without pretense, struck a chord. Because they were true. And because they came from someone who saw the man he was, without comparisons, without past, without weight. Lives went on, each in its own time. Olivia, more introspective, dedicated herself to new projects. She traveled alone, read more, and began writing a blog about choices, losses, and new beginnings. Without exposing herself directly, she transformed her pain into reflections that, to her surprise, began to touch others. She received messages from strangers who said, "It seems you wrote what I couldn't put into words." And that was how she began to find new meaning. She might never experience what she'd experienced with Ethan again, but that wasn't the focus anymore. The focus was on not making the same mistakes. It was on making that pain serve a greater purpose. Fate, always unexpected, decided to cross their paths one last time, years later, at a charity event hosted by a social organization they both became supporters of at different points in their lives. When they saw each other, there was no longer any tension, no discomfort, but there was also no intimacy. It was the reunion of two worlds that had once been one and now only respected each other. They spoke briefly. Ethan introduced Clara casually, and Olivia humbly praised the project he was supporting. It was brief but sincere. Neither of them carried any visible resentment. Neither was trying to prove anything. They simply accepted what they were now, closed stories that left their mark but did not define the present. On the way home, Clara commented, "She seems at peace." And Ethan replied, "Yes, she is. And that's good." Clara smiled, touched his hand, and said nothing more. Because some stories don't need to be relived, just respected for what they were. And in that moment, Ethan understood that, despite everything, life had given him back something essential, the ability to trust, to feel, to love without fear. He was no longer the man he once was. And, for that very reason, he was finally ready to live in the present without carrying the weight of yesterday. Time, relentless and generous, did its work. And both understood, each in their own way, that not all stories need a new beginning. Some just need a dignified ending. And that end was near. The reunion at the charity event could have been just another discreet exchange between two acquaintances, but in both cases, it left a different seed. Olivia returned home with her mind racing, but not from regret or longing, but from the strange feeling that, finally, she had been seen again by him, not as the love of the past, nor as the woman who betrayed him, but as a whole person, separate from the wound she had caused. This made her reflect on how much she still saw herself through the lens of her mistake. For the first time, she truly wished people would stop seeing her as the woman who lost the great love of her life. She wanted to be seen for who she was now. And that wasn't easy, not even for herself. But something shifted there. Seeing Ethan beside Clara, realizing he was happy in a way she'd never known how to sustain, Olivia understood that love wasn't just a feeling, it was a structure. And she'd never had the structure to love that way. The Sunday after the event, Olivia went to visit her mother, something she had been avoiding for months. Their relationship had never been simple, but after their separation, the tension intensified. Her mother, a woman of strong opinions and few filters, had made it clear how much she disapproved of her choices. But that day, Olivia wanted to face it. She arrived with a cake in her hand and a sincere plea in her eyes. The conversation began tensely, as usual, full of swallowed sentences and harsh silences, until her mother, looking directly at her, said with painful frankness, "You've always been afraid of being truly loved. That's why you destroyed it when you received it." Olivia took a deep breath, lowered her eyes, and didn't argue. For the first time, she had no defense. She silently agreed, recognizing there a naked truth she had never wanted to face. After a few minutes, her mother softened her tone, approached, and held her hand firmly. "But I raised you to rise, not to live on the ground. Just rise with more sense now." And that, coming from her, was the closest thing to forgiveness he had ever received. Meanwhile, Ethan was preparing a trip with Clara. It wasn't an escape, it wasn't euphoria, it was a gift for both of them. They decided to visit a small coastal town he'd frequented as a child but hadn't visited in decades. The place wasn't luxurious, but it was memorable. He wanted to share a piece of his story with her. During the trip, they laughed like teenagers, got lost in narrow streets, ate at beachside stalls, and watched the sunset in silence. One afternoon, sitting on the sand, Clara told him about her greatest fear, being loved by someone still incomplete. And he, with the sincerity that had always guided him, replied, "I rebuilt myself before loving you. If I'd arrived earlier, I might not have known how to care for you." She smiled, her eyes brimming, leaned her head on his shoulder, and said, "Then it was perfect timing." Back in the city, routines fell back into place. Olivia, more present in her own life, allowed herself to truly start over. She began attending reading groups, not to fill voids, but to nurture new interests. She met different people, got involved in social causes, and began giving lectures on emotional communication in corporate environments. Little by little, she built a new identity, far from the label of a cheating woman, far from the shadow of what she lost. She no longer sought redemption with Ethan, and this acceptance, paradoxically, was what liberated her most. She learned that not every request for forgiveness needs to be met with a return. Sometimes, the most valuable forgiveness is the one you give yourself. Ethan and Clara began to talk more openly about the future. One Sunday, while organizing books, she found an old notebook with his scribbles, reflections written in the darkest days after the breakup. She read a few pages, with his permission, and when she finished, she said softly, "You survived your greatest pain. This makes you stronger than you think." He responded with only a kiss on the top of her head, knowing she understood everything, even without needing him to explain. That same night, he looked at Clara as she slept and understood, with a rare peace, that she wasn't the reward for being betrayed. She was the right choice of a man who had finally learned to choose himself. Months later, a storm hit the city with unusual force. One of those rains that paralyzes streets, knocks down trees, and knocks out lights. Olivia was alone in the house, the power out, the sound of wind ripping through the windows. On impulse, she reached for the box containing Ethan's letters. She lit candles, sat on the living room floor, and reread some, not out of longing, but out of gratitude. Tears flowed, but they weren't of pain. They were of understanding. She had been loved deeply, and even though she hadn't been able to hold it back, she now knew how much it had shaped the woman she was becoming. It was there, on that night lit only by candles and memories, that she understood completely. True love teaches even in absence. It isn't just presence, it's a mirror. And when lived well, even when it's over, it continues to echo. A few weeks later, Clara was surprised by a message from Olivia. A direct, respectful text, thanking her for caring for Ethan, for being part of his new beginning, and saying she wholeheartedly hoped she would make him as happy as he deserved. Clara, with her characteristic elegance, simply replied, "He's happy. And so am I. I wish you the same." There was no venom, no argument. They were two women who, in different ways, had learned from the same man. From that day on, something was completely at peace. The cycle ended not with a bang, but with mutual understanding. And that was rarer and more precious than any romantic reconciliation. The last autumn before this story's definitive end, Ethan returned to the veranda of an old cafe he and Olivia used to frequent in their early years together. He was there with Clara, reading, when he noticed the ambient music playing was the same kind he used to play when he and Olivia were still just us. He smiled with his head bowed, not out of longing, but out of respect for the memory. Clara noticed and said, "Did you think about her?" He replied naturally, "Yes." But only for a second. Not with pain, just with recognition. She squeezed his hand across the table, and they continued in silence, no longer needing to fight for space with the past. Life, then, fell into place. Not like a story where everyone ends up together, but like a story where everyone ends up where they should. And that, surprising as it was exactly what everyone needed. That past love wasn't in vain. It was necessary. It was a seed, it was pain, it was a mirror. And now, with his heart finally at peace, Ethan was approaching something greater than happiness, he was approaching truth. And truth, even when it comes after chaos, always finds a way to be peace. It was on an ordinary late afternoon, with the orange sky stained with heavy clouds, that Ethan made the decision that would definitively close any bridge with the past. After years of inner silence, rebuilding, surrendering to a new life, he felt there was something that still needed to be done. Not out of resentment, not nostalgia, but emotional justice. He took out his old notebook, the one where he used to write his rawest reflections on difficult days, and decided to leave it behind. In it, there was no rancor, but rather the words of a man who was betrayed and chose to reinvent himself, not out of pride, but out of integrity. At the end, he wrote the final sentence: "Whoever destroys a pure love, not only loses the other, he loses himself." After that, he closed the notebook, took a deep breath, and left it in the neighborhood's community library, as if he were giving the world the last memory of what had once nearly broken him completely. Olivia learned of this by chance, weeks later, when a reader of her blog contacted her to say she'd found a notebook in a public space and that the text seemed to echo what she herself had read in the blog's author's words. When Olivia read that notebook, she recognized the handwriting, the cadence of the sentences, the soul behind each line. She read it with a lump in her throat and, for the first time, understood the depths of Ethan's experience without her seeing. She felt shame, yes, but also respect. He had closed the cycle more elegantly than she ever could have. There, in that solitary reading, she finally accepted that some losses are permanent and that no gesture, request, or effort can rewrite what was destroyed by one's own hands. She wept, not out of despair, but out of acceptance. Because there was nothing left to try to recover. And, in a way, that was liberating. Over time, Olivia's blog grew. People began to see her not just as a woman who had experienced betrayal, but as someone who had come away with a profound transformation. In an intimate talk to a group of women, she said something that shushed the room. Betrayal doesn't start with another body, it starts when you stop caring for the love you receive. She wasn't seeking applause. She didn't want to be admired. She simply wanted to prevent others from making the same mistake. At a meeting with young university students, she was asked a direct question, "Do you regret it?" And, looking the young man in the eye, she answered, "Every day." But not with guilt. With responsibility. The pain still lingered within her, but now it was useful. It had a purpose. It was a scar, not a wound. Meanwhile, Ethan and Clara were quietly married in an outdoor ceremony, surrounded only by their closest friends. Nothing grand, nothing flashy. But there was something there that had never been before, shared depth. It wasn't a love that tried to heal wounds, it was a love between two whole people. Ethan gave a short speech, without pre-written phrases, but with a truth that moved even those who didn't know him well. He said it took him years to understand that it's not enough to love someone, you have to love someone who also knows how to stay. Clara looked at him with teary eyes, knowing it wasn't about the past, but about how much he had been reborn. And it was with this reborn man that she had chosen to walk. Years later, when Olivia crossed paths with Ethan and Clara again, now with a young daughter by their side, something in her stirred, but it didn't hurt. There was nostalgia, yes, but without bitterness. The girl smiled at her with the innocence only children possess, and for a moment, she felt the weight of everything she'd lost. Not just the man, but the life he could have built, the choices he didn't make, the bridges he'd burned with his own hands. They spoke briefly, with the maturity of someone who understands that some stories don't require a fresh start, only a dignified closure. She wished him happiness. He thanked her sincerely. After that, they walked away, and she never looked back. Clara, upon noticing the encounter, didn't ask for details. She trusted him, but more than that, she knew Ethan had completely made peace with his past. She wasn't an insecure or competitive woman. She knew who she was and her place. That night, as she tucked her daughter into bed, she saw Ethan watching the little girl sleep and said softly, "Thank you for waiting for the right time to love me." And he, with a calm smile, replied, "You arrived when my heart was ready." Olivia continued her life, now as a published author. Her book, a collection of texts about love, loss, and rebuilding, was well received, not because it was technical, but because it was honest. She had loyal readers who saw in her proof that even the worst mistakes can be transformed into something useful. She never had a great love again, and she learned to accept this with serenity. Not as a punishment, but as a consequence. Sometimes, the greatest love in life is also the only one. And this doesn't have to be sad, it can be a lesson. She learned to be self-sufficient, to understand herself, to respect herself. And, in a way, she loved Ethan more in the silence of his absence than she ever was able to love while he was present. In the end, each person had their own destiny. Ethan, the man of integrity, found a love that recognized his worth. Clara, a sensitive and strong woman, found a partner who didn't bring ghosts, but open hands. Olivia, the one who destroyed her own home, found purpose in her pain, but will forever carry the memory of what she lost. Not out of self-punishment, but out of clarity. Because some mistakes stay with us even after we've healed. Now I want to know, what did you think of this story? Which part touched you most? Comment below with your opinion, it's very important to us. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and share this with someone who needs to hear this story through to the end. And never forget, betrayal destroys more than a relationship. It destroys trust, peace, self-esteem, and often, an entire future. True love is rare, and if you're lucky enough to find one, cherish it, respect it, and stay with it. Because when you lose true love, what you lose isn't just the other person, it's the chance to experience something that may never come back. This channel will never support any kind of betrayal. Our stories are fictional, but the impact of human choices is very real. Until the next story.